So in principle, it was not meant to be a one-party state. Not at all. And not only can it include multiple parties from the outset, but it can also generate new political differences in the course of the revolution. That's one thing. But the other thing is, I point out that during war communism, Trotsky had advocated for militarizing labor, for basically turning the labor unions into appendages of the state. And Lenin opposed that, saying that the workers needed to defend themselves not only against the state, but even against the Bolshevik party. So he was against subsuming the unions under the party. He certainly was against subsuming the unions under the state. And, the background, the Marxist movement before 1917, these political parties were fiercely independent. They were the most independent of all political parties. So realistically, how are you going to get a majority or even a significant plurality of the working class in a country like the United States to organize and be mobilized and be able to lead the rest of society in making a revolution? You're not going to do it by being against civil liberties. Middle-class kids might be hostile to civil liberties, but no, you're never going to lead the masses that way. Never.
You're listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.
We think that ideology is something blurring, confusing our straight view. Ideology should be glasses which distort our view. And the critique of ideology should be the opposite. Like you take off the glasses so that you can finally see the way things really are.
When you talk about a revolution, most people think violence, without realizing that the real content of any kind of revolutionary thrust lies in the principles and the goals that you're striving for, not in the way you reach them.
Philosophers call someone a relativist, by which they mean it's a person that holds that any view is as good as any other view. My simple response to that is this: no one holds that view. No one believes that every view is as good as every other view.
Welcome to One Dime Radio. Today I am here with Chris Cutrone, founder of the Platypus Affiliated Society. If you don't know about Chris Cutrone, you're in for a treat. I was first introduced to Chris Cutrone in 2019, I believe, and I listened to a lot of your talks over COVID, and I found a lot of my leftist presuppositions just getting continually shattered. And I won't say I agree with everything you say, but you definitely provide a lot of compelling perspectives. Particularly what I like most about what you're doing is revitalizing the importance of the connection between liberalism and Marxism, and Marxism's liberal origins and its relation to it, and that gets lost on left today. So we're going to talk about that in today's episode. Particularly, you have this very controversial essay that you presented. People can find it in the description, called Lenin's Liberalism. Now, people who are going to see that in the title are going to immediately type in the comments saying, what do you mean? Of course, Lenin wasn't a liberal. So we'll use this to branch into a broader discussion of liberalism, Marxism, and the state of the left. But what were you getting at with this thesis, Lenin's Liberalism?
Okay, so the original context for that piece was a panel at the Left Forum that the Platypus Affiliated Society organized. It was one of a series of panels. So we did Marx and Engels' Marxism, we did Trotsky's Marxism, Lukács's Marxism, and then we did maybe Rosa Luxemburg's Marxism. It was like a bunch of panels that we organized, and the panel that this was presented on was Lenin's Marxism. And it was with Lars Lee, who published a very influential book on Lenin, actually a couple of books on Lenin. Lenin's What is to be Done in Context. So a new translation of What is to be Done, but also really a book written around what is to be done. And then a biography of Lenin, Lars Lee provided as well, and was very influential for a certain moment on the millennial left. So he was on the panel, and also Paul LeBlanc, who's a longtime activist and scholar. He's written a lot on Marx and Engels and on Lenin and on Rosa Luxemburg. And yeah, so it was the three of us discussing Lenin's Marxism, and this was the intervention that I wanted to make with respect to Lenin. I had previously presented, Platypus had done a panel, I think in 2009. This was in 2011, that Lenin's Liberalism is taken from. 2009, we had done a panel of just all Platypus members speaking on the decline of the left in the 20th century. And we did it through a series of dates. We did it 2001, 1968, 1933, and 1917. And I did 1917. And in that, I presented on Luxemburg and Lenin, Rosa Luxemburg and Vladimir Lenin, as figures who are usually pitched against each other, opposed to each other, but really trying to establish what they had in common, and how basically a kind of more liberal or libertarian left had taken up Rosa Luxemburg, whereas Lenin was associated with the authoritarian left. So you know the meme, or the two axes of authoritarianism versus libertarianism and socialism versus capitalism. My point was that original historical Marxism, Marx and Engels, and also people like Rosa Luxemburg and Lenin, they actually would not be anywhere on that map in those four quadrants, and they'd be everywhere on those four quadrants. In other words, they wouldn't really fit that. And so, yeah, I followed up with this piece, Lenin's Liberalism, in order to talk about really Lenin, but also Lenin as a Marxist, and in his Marxism, his relation to liberalism. And so Lars Lee had, really emphasized how Lenin was a figure of the Second International, Marxism, and of Kautskyan Marxism, that he was a Kautskyist. And that's true. That is true, especially in What Is to Be Done. But one could say that Lenin was very much a kind of Kautskyan Marxist. And yet, again, the Second International is understood as somehow reformist and therefore perhaps liberal, whereas the Third International is like revolutionary and Leninist, communist as opposed to social democratic. So there are all sorts of assumptions built in the language that we use today. When we say liberalism, we usually mean progressive liberalism. We mean liberalism in the 20th century, and we usually mean Cold War liberalism. So we especially mean post-World War II, kind of social democratic, welfare state, progressive liberal capitalism, as opposed to the East Bloc, the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, communist China, Vietnam, Korea, etc., Cuba. And that introduces a lot of confusions, I think, or when we use that term, liberalism.
Yeah, so definitely a slur today. If it's
On the
liberal,
left.
it's used by the left to kind of demonize people who aren't left enough.
Right.
And for right wingers, it's to
Oh.
just demonize anyone who is to their left.
To be progressive. Right. And so another, a lot of this comes out of the 60s, New Left. A lot of this kind of anti-liberalism or disenchantment with liberalism. So we have to remember that until the Reagan era, liberalism was the dominant political ideology in the United States. So the Democratic Party, as a progressive liberal party, the kind of flip that happened with FDR and the New Deal, when the Democrats used to be the conservative party, they became the progressive party with FDR. And in the United States,
Started a little before, like Wilson.
yeah, but Wilson is, very problematic, obviously, from a progressive standpoint. He is associated with progressivism, but really progressivism was Teddy Roosevelt.
Yeah,
And
him too, of course.
And it comes out of the fact that the Republicans were the progressive liberal party after the Civil War, coming out of the Civil War, and the Democrats were the conservatives. And that's most obvious in the fact that they upheld racism. And they upheld racism, segregation, legal racism, Jim Crow, out of conservative liberalism. In other words, what you have in the United States is conservative liberals and progressive liberals in the capitalist era. And that's most clearly expressed in the period starting with the Civil War. Before that, it's a little bit more complicated, with Andrew Jackson, etc., the birth of the Democratic Party. But insofar as the Democrats represented like de jure, official, institutional racism, they did so on the basis of defending civil society against the state. Like they were basically saying, oh, the Republicans want to force Black people and white people to live together as equals. And we're upholding the right of white people to not do that if they don't want to. Right? So they were
That's why some people on the left completely dismiss liberalism. Like I had this conversation in the last podcast with James Vaughan, how scholars like Domenico Lazzurro use that as a basis for dismissing liberalism.
right.
It's fundamentally incompatible with any emancipatory politics because they, draw on how John C. Calhoun, right, is
Yes.
defending states' rights, to uphold
Right.
slavery.
Right. So, okay, so let me just establish my terms. So for me, liberalism, so there's modern liberalism, progressive liberalism, that's what we use liberalism as a shorthand for. But then there's classical liberalism, or we call it classical liberal thought, as opposed to liberalism. Right, so liberalism is really an invention of the capitalist era. It comes out of the 19th century. And it's a kind of, anything with an ism is a kind of reification of it. It's a kind of ossification of it, as opposed to, its kind of true spirit. So, classical liberal thinkers versus liberalism. That would be one distinction to make. But
And you would associate which thinkers with classical liberalism, because that's also a important line of demarcation.
I suppose that it is, of course, John Locke, The Glorious Revolution, not Hobbes. Hobbes is not a liberal. But John Locke, and really the whole Lockean influence in the 18th century and the 1700s, Rousseau, who's called by 20th century liberals a kind of totalitarian thinker. Like Karl Popper condemned Rousseau, but Rousseau's a liberal. Adam Smith is a liberal. And of course, the American revolutionaries are liberals. Also, Edmund Burke, the father of modern conservatism, he's also a liberal. He is. So,
on the right wing of liberalism, probably. And then John Stuart Mill, perhaps, on the left wing.
John Stuart Mill, sure. John Stuart Mill's in a different era. He's in the capitalist era, but I'm referring to people before the Industrial Revolution is really fully felt in its effects. Of course, the Industrial Revolution is going on. It's already going on in Rousseau's time, beginning. It certainly is going on in Adam Smith's time, but it's not registering.
Would you put Hegel?
Oh, Hegel. Okay, so Kant, of course. We had both Kant's birthday, 300th birthday, but also Lenin's birthday. So Lenin and Kant share a birthday, which I think is great. It's very appropriate. But it's also Earth Day, is a little bit more problematic. So we'll leave that to one side. But Kant is certainly a liberal. And so is Hegel. But again, Hegel and Hegelianism, especially Hegelianism, the division in Hegel's followers between the old Hegelians and the young Hegelians, between the left Hegelians and the right Hegelians, then you start to get into the conservatism of liberalism, or how liberalism can be used ideologically to justify the status quo. Benjamin Constant, I'll mention him as a classical liberal as well, very important figure, associated with Napoleon. I guess you could say, in terms of the French Revolution, Lafayette, who's a figure in both the American and the French Revolution. Of course, he's a liberal.
Oh, Thomas Paine, yeah.
Oh, Thomas Paine. Basically, all the American revolutionaries are liberals, I would say, pretty unequivocally. What you get there is, because it is a revolution and because they are trying to build upon and go beyond the English Revolution, then you get into the sort of, okay, well, what does this kind of liberal bourgeois view of society, what does freedom, look like actually in practice. And that's where you get the Federalists and the Federalist Papers, and also you get the first split. You get the split among the American revolutionaries. You basically get Thomas Jefferson leading a little mini revolution within the revolution in 1800 to try to restore the revolution against John Adams, Alexander Hamilton. Right. And but the later Democratic Party of Andrew Jackson is not Thomas Jefferson. And in fact, the Republican Party that comes up later is an attempt to reestablish Jefferson's party, which was the Democratic Republican Party, and which was referred to shorthand as the Republican Party. So the Republican Party that the abolitionists join and that prosecutes the Civil War and abolishes slavery, it, comes out of an attempt to reestablish the Jeffersonian Democratic Republican Party, and involves a split of the Whigs, right? So the Whigs would have been more progressive than the Democrats, than Andrew Jackson's Democrats, and then there's a split in the Whigs, and the Republican Party comes out of that. So again, there's a kind of a complicated history here, but in terms of liberal political thinkers, right? Classical liberal political thinkers. So I would define liberal thought or liberalism, but not in the reified, ossified ideological sense, but in the original emancipatory sense, as establishing the importance of the distinction between civil society and the state. That would be one definition, a very important definition of classical liberal thought. Upholding the freedom of civil society against the state and subordinating the state to civil society. The other would be a kind of a later problem, we would say, but political pluralism, minority rights in the political sphere, political pluralism. In other words, just the desire to preserve a dynamic political realm, which you don't have a kind of just established dominant majoritarian capture of the political sphere at the expense of any dissent. Right. So political dissent, political pluralism, and really the separation of the social sphere from the political sphere, or as Benjamin Constant puts it, civil liberty as opposed to political liberty. Right. So that's really what liberal thought is about. And by the way, that's where socialism comes from, because socialism is asserting the rights of society. That's the entire point of socialism, is it is to be true to society, to have the political sphere be true to society in the capitalist era, which presents problems because the state tends to represent the interests of capital at the expense of the interests of society.
And I guess some context for younger listeners is, of course, this liberalism's responding to absolute monarchy, and absolute monarchy shorthand is absolutism. And people use was an extreme concentration of state power relative to older feudal monarchies,
right,
more centralized in nature. So,
right,
just some context. But I know some people will probably respond immediately, just instinctually. Marxists will say, "Well, the civil society thing, isn't that what Marx is criticizing in Hegel's critique of the philosophy, in the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, and in the German ideology, probably most." A good example of his critique of liberalism, because he, of course, critiques the idea of a neutral, like a lot of basically liberal assumptions regarding the national interests, civil society, and private domination.
Okay,
yeah.
Let me say something about that.
Trying to get us into that. How do we bridge?
So the absolutism, the absolute monarchy. Yeah. First of all, it's the modern monarchical system that arises in the bourgeois era. So it's a rather late development. So Louis XIV establishes it in France in the 17th century, in the 1600s. It comes a little bit earlier in England. You could say that the split of the from the papal authority with Henry VIII, right? But also you could say, Elizabeth. There's a kind of a deeper history, but immediately complicated by the English Revolution, the English Civil War, and then the Glorious Revolution. So the absolute monarchy is an alliance between the king and the bourgeoisie against the feudal aristocracy. That's where absolutism comes from. It's where the king, it goes from being just a representative of the aristocracy to being above the aristocracy. So there was a time, if you go back to the medieval era, kings were elected among the aristocrats. So the aristocrats elected a king. And they would occasionally then take up kind of dynastical regimes, but it wasn't absolutism. So absolutism is when the king is not just a member of the aristocracy, but above the aristocracy. And the bourgeoisie supports in order to establish its freedom against the aristocracy. Right? So that's important because constitutional monarchy, you could say the constitutional monarchical system, actually has its roots in absolutism. In other words, where there is a, established relationship between the king and his subjects. That's why it even goes back earlier. Sometimes people will say the Magna Carta.
Well, yeah, I was about to say,
Right?
isn't it also the aristocracy establishing its authority, its right against the monarchy? Because that's, especially in England, a big part of the history too, no?
It is. And so this is where, it's a complicated, concrete history that has a lot of organic evolution to it. Like no one masterminded this. So liberal thought, from a Marxist standpoint, how Marx and Engels understood liberal thought is that it's a late recognition of bourgeois society. So Marx agrees with Hegel that the owl of Minerva flies at dusk, that consciousness comes post festum, ex post facto, comes after the fact. So the idea is that bourgeois society only really recognized itself in the late 1700s, even though it had been developing out of the late medieval period. It had been developing through the Renaissance and through the Protestant Reformation and all the wars and drama associated with that. The Treaty of Westphalia, the Westphalian system, is a product of bourgeois society. So consciousness of this new bourgeois society, consciousness that is not a kind of return to classical antiquity, not a resurrection of ancient Greek and Roman thought, and that is not understood in Christian terms, kind of secular, historical self-consciousness of bourgeois society comes rather late. And it really comes with Locke and with the Enlightenment. And Rousseau is a kind of radicalization of that in the mid-1700s. And that's why Rousseau is so influential. Rousseau is a foundational for Adam Smith, for Kant, for Hegel, and for Marx. So it's a late consciousness that comes. And again, no one did this deliberately, right? At least in the liberal view, it happens more spontaneously, organically. It's a transformation of the third estate. It's a transformation of society from a subsistence agricultural system into a free labor system, right? And that takes hundreds of years. And it's very uneven, especially at the political realm, in the realm of political thinking. So, there's classical republicanism that's developed in the bourgeois era. But again, that will give you only one side of things. The other side of things is the recognition of society. And that's really what distinguishes liberal thought per se. And so you could say, yes, it's rights of society against the state, first in the form of the monarchy, the absolute monarchy. But really, it's an attempt to subordinate that monarchy, to resituate that monarchy, to say, okay, what role does the monarch play on behalf of society. Right. So it's and of course the American and French revolutions are all bound up in that. We tend to, with the French Revolution in particular, we tend to think it's a revolt against the king. It's of course, as much against the aristocracy and against the church. So the aristocrats in the church are the ones who are really the targets of the French Revolution. The king is as well, but the king could always be reconfigured into this constitutional monarchical role. Of course, that's what goes on in the process of the English Revolution as well. In the American Revolution, it's different. It's really about the crisis of the constitutional monarchy in England with respect to the colonists. It's, no taxation without representation. It's about parliamentary representation. So the American Revolution could have been avoided if they had given parliamentary representation to the colonists. And also, there was, in England, in the UK, there was already a movement to reform Parliament that also looked to local democratic self-governance of the colonies, that looked at what the Americans were doing. So our system should be like that over here. So again, all of that comes out of a sense that society has rights. And that includes, of course, individuals in society. Right. So I think there are a lot of false premises we have to sort of do away with. So when Marx criticizes liberalism in the 19th century and says that it takes as its starting point what is the result of a historical process, namely the bourgeois individual. Well, earlier bourgeois thought had also recognized that the individual is a product of society. Rousseau, for example. Right?
Especially Hegel.
And especially Hegel. But really, again, starting with Rousseau and then you get, with Adam Smith and Kant, there is this idea that we are what and who we are by virtue of our upbringing, our education. That there might be some sort of innate talent, but that really doesn't count very much if it's not developed, if it's not sort of educated. So the Enlightenment is all about education. It's all about how the individual is formed in society. And so, why would liberals defend the rights of individuals? Because the rights of individuals are social rights. In other words, the right of an individual is the right of an individual that represents society, that is social, that is a moment of the social. So the minority, the isolated individual is essential to society because society made the individual what it is, right? So that's, again, the dialectic of the individual and the collective was crucial in bourgeois thought, in how modern society understood itself. The relation between the individual and the collective, and the emergence of the bourgeois individual out of more traditional collectivities, right? So a transformed collectivity, bourgeois social relations, a transformed individual. Because it's not like it's not like only aristocrats were allowed to be bourgeois individuals or something. They weren't individuals at all. They were the property of their family. They were the property of their caste. There were no individuals in the aristocracy. Even the king wasn't an individual in this way that we think of our individuality. Because these were not people who were playing roles. These were people who were their social function through and through, completely and totally. So the freedom of the individual in bourgeois society is the freedom of society. It is social freedom. It is the way society transforms itself.
And that might sound strange in recent history, given that neoliberalism, the term associated with it, is there's no such thing as society, famous quote from Thatcher. And it seems like there's been an inversion in liberalism, almost in many ways, with where civil society itself seems to kind of eviscerate it at the hands of the market, perhaps. Because now when people talk about civil society, people think you're really just saying you're talking about the market. You're trying to establish the rights of the market, and thus they retroactively read that into old liberals. I was guilty of this too, which is, you know, with our lens today, you can look at old liberals and you think, oh, they're really just advocating freedom of the market, freedom
Right.
of capital.
Right. I mean, I think that the danger is with young people, if I do say so myself, as a middle-aged person, as someone who feels old now, I can say, because I was there, I was a teenage Marxist. I definitely was. And basically, I was very discontented. It was in the Reagan era. I was very discontent. And I just took all the values of society and sort of shot them down. Said, oh, it's all bullshit. It's all a lie. It's all a cruel deception. It's all hypocrisy. And maybe it's not just a violation of the values that they claim, but the values in and of themselves are wrong. It's a real problem, right? Because this society functions according to its values. The vast majority of people believe in these social values. And from a Marxist perspective, the social values are not just ideas that come out of social reality, meaning we have the ideas that we have because of the society we live in. And I think one mistake is to think that somehow these values are just the values, these ideas are just the values and ideas of the ruling class, and that the rest of us are brainwashed with these ideas, that we're deceived by these ideas.
Yeah,
I would
definitely be a very surface level reading of the German ideology.
Oh, of
The
course.
famous quote, the ruling ideas are the ideas of the ruling class, right?
And they didn't publish that book for a reason, I'll say. They did not publish that book for a reason. It's polemical. They weren't sure that the polemic had really fired off well. Right. In the famous 1859 preface to the Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, Marx said, well, you know, we didn't publish that book and we'll just leave it to the mice to chew it up. It's gone. It's fine. It's gone. It's fine. Right. So they thought that they could do better. I mean, they also wrote The Holy Family, which is a wild ride, and that they did publish. Right. So that was also a critique of the young Hegelians. They're both critiques of the young Hegelians. German ideology and the Holy Family are both critiques of the young Hegelians. And they're very arch. Marx and Engels are quite arch. And we can lose their point rather easily with a too literal reading. So, you know, even, you know, social being determining consciousness, people think that means that like a sociology of knowledge, it depends on your class position, how you see the world. Standpoint epistemology. No. All this is wrong, or at least we should question it.
Identity politics, basically, for the audience who don't know what standpoint epistemology is, basically like the academic ideology behind what we might associate with identity politics, and that could include class identity politics.
Yeah, you know where it's all started. Standpoint epistemology starts with Stalinized Marxism. That's where it comes from. It comes from a kind of positivistic Marxism that says, you know, peasants have one perspective and know the world in one way, and landlords have another perspective and know the world in a different way. Now, the capitalist has a different epistemology than the worker. You know, that would be a caste system. We don't live in a caste system. We don't. We live in a class system. Everybody in this society is bourgeois. Everybody's bourgeois. And I also maintain that the only people who really believe in bourgeois ideals and values are the working class. The capitalist class does not believe in bourgeois ideals. They do
Oh, yeah,
not.
you've said this before, and this is something that I think is a really perplexing point to some, is what do you mean by bourgeois society in crisis? You say that a lot in your work, and I think that relates to clarify what you're saying right now, which is we're all bourgeois. You've also said before not all culture is bourgeois. I think you said that before.
No.
And also that the ruling class no longer really believe in bourgeois ideals, but the working class does. some point of clarification between that, because I think that
Okay.
that'd be very interesting. I do see where the Frankfurt School said stuff like that.
They
Like
did, but nobody
people know-
understands the Frankfurt School. So let's sort of bring it back to brass tacks, if you will.
Sure.
The Protestant work ethic. The Protestant work ethic. That's a bourgeois ideal. Salvation through work. Right? Respecting oneself as God's creation, respecting God's creation in a new and different way than traditional Christianity, than Catholicism. Right? So now the way we give glory to God's creation in ourselves, in the world, is through work. We're meant to participate in God's creation. We're meant to improve God's creation through our labor on nature and through our self-development and improvement through our own work. Traditional Christianity, Catholicism, treated this as a heresy, and they tried to wipe it out. So why did they not succeed in wiping out? They had like 100-something years of war. Millions of people were killed. So why did Protestantism win? Because it's a consciousness of bourgeois social relations. That's where it comes from. That's why it held out. That's why it survived. That's why it transformed Christianity, because even the Catholicism was transformed. So was bourgeoisified. And, there were some, hints of that coming. Thomas Aquinas, as opposed to Duns Scotus, who Heidegger wrote his dissertation on, right? So the modern world is the world of bourgeois value. And again, who believes it? Who believes it? Who believes in the work ethic? Not the people managing their portfolios with inherited wealth. They don't. They're into all the post-human, postmodern shit.
What would you say about democracy, though? Because I've made a point that might seem a little antithetical to this, because I noticed that democracy, if you look at data when it comes to voter turnout, the working class just does not vote nearly as much as and the whole save democracy rallying cry that you see with especially the professional managerial class. If you believe it's a class or not, I believe it's a social category regardless. And you see save democracy, but I don't think that really resonates. I think most people don't believe that by banning Trump from running in the elections, you somehow are saving democracy. Most people don't believe that, but you do see this
Well, some people believe.
More, managerial class.
Yeah,
So,
my colleagues in academia believe it.
So, but isn't that kind of, if you're saying the ruling class don't believe in bourgeois ideals, are you saying democracy, I guess, isn't?
Isn't what democracy means? Democracy means the adults in the room. It means technocracy, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Right? It means meritocracy. Right? So it's this funny thing. I mean, why does the working class not vote? Because the two dominant political parties in the United States don't want the working class to vote. They don't really make an appeal to them to vote. They only do so very marginally. And they do so in a very measured way because they would like a narrow electorate. They would like to compete between each other over a narrow group of voters in which the issues are very clearly defined. And really, they're just offering different technocratic management regimes. Right? So, insofar as they haven't already divided up the electorate according to region, geographical region, and culture wars kind of issues, then there's some swing vote, there's some middle-class swing vote, the suburban swing vote, who will decide, yeah, we gave one party a chance, now we would need to give the other party a chance. And who will, vote on the basis of like tax and regulation policies, and maybe nowadays like trade policies. I mean, the one thing that I'll say about the present moment and democracy is that, the United States hasn't been terribly democratic for a long time. And really in the modern capitalist era, coming out of the post-Civil War, post-Reconstruction, the Second Industrial Revolution. It's been geared more towards, especially, you mentioned Woodrow Wilson, been geared towards a more technocratic, bureaucratic political regime. And since FDR, the Democrats have been the dominant party in the United States. So they've governed the majority of the population. They've governed the cities and the high population states pretty consistently. And the Republicans have been the loyal opposition. They've basically accepted the Democratic Party's framework, and they've been the loyal opposition. So Gore Vidal in the 60s famously said, there's only one party in the United States, the party of property. What he meant by that was, of course, the party of capital. And he said, one party with two right wings. Okay. So that's just true. That's simply the case. And so there was a moment in the mid-20th century where you had a more organized politics that tried to integrate and include the working class, especially the organized working class, the unionized working class, into the political order. Again, through this kind of New Deal Democratic Party kind of structure. But in the era of neoliberalism, since the crisis of that form of politics, it started in the 60s and really bloomed in the 70s. And then, of course, since the Reagan Revolution, there has been a kind of less of a desire to try to actively integrate the working class. And there's been basically an encouragement, not just an accommodation to, but an active encouragement of diminished voter participation. And local elections, by the way, which are meant to be the most democratic. Kristen Sinema, once made fun of the idea that states are the laboratory of democracy. So she said some really pointed thing about Arizona. She said, yeah, Arizona is the meth lab of democracy. Basically talking about the dysfunction. So local elections have the least turnout, have the least participation, which is interesting. And yet those would be the more concrete, substantial policy issues affecting people's lives on a day-to-day basis. And yet people vote even less in that context than they do in national elections, which are these, weird marketing campaigns, almost purely ideological.
Mm-hmm. That's the subject of a lot of the stuff I write about. Though my dissertation was on the concept of managed democracy by Sheldon Wolin. Circling back to bourgeois values and their relation to Marxism, as we'll get into it, you often say, and James Vaughan, who I recently had on the pod, also say, when they're talking about the trajectory of liberalism and why it's both necessary and impossible, that bourgeois society entered into crisis, and this is during capitalism. What do you really mean by what do you mean by that, bourgeois society into crisis, and what does it have to do with liberalism's trajectory?
Okay, so in a very simple term, if bourgeois social relations are, as Marx said, the social relations of labor, and again, building on the earlier liberal thought, John Locke thought property is based on labor. It's not based on possession, on, physical strength. Might makes right. He said, no, labor makes right. Might doesn't make right. Labor makes right. Meaning the land belongs to the peasants because they're farming it. It doesn't really belong to the lord, who just is the scion of a family that conquered it back in the Middle Ages. The aristocracy, where the aristocracy comes from, right? They're the Germanic tribes that conquered Europe in the wake of the Roman Empire. So why Britain became England is because it was conquered by the Anglo-Saxons. So they were the aristocracy over the indigenous population. Why Gaul became France because they were conquered by the Franks, a German tribe. They were the aristocracy, and the Gallic Celtic people were the peasants. They were the conquered people. So the bourgeois revolution really is a slave revolt. It's the only successful slave revolt in history.
That's a statement that will trigger some people for sure. Some people will think it's a slaveocracy revolt.
No,
That's the new popular thing today, which is
it is.
the slave owners revolt.
It's tendentious nonsense, and it's just extreme Democratic Party propaganda at this point, right? Because the Democrats style themselves to be the party that represents Black people. Right? So, but what we're talking about now is the rights of labor are established by bourgeois society, meaning social right, legal right, is going to be based on labor, not on force. And that's going to be the claim, by the way, for colonialism. The claim is going to be that the English settlers can build up the land in America, whereas the Native Americans are just doing hunting and gathering. They're not doing anything with it, right? They're not improving agriculture. They're not developing society. And therefore, the laboring English settlers are going to take the reins, and then the Native Americans will catch up. That's what Adam Smith thought. The Native Americans are going to eventually follow along, and then they're going to be able to establish their rights on the basis of labor. So how and why did that not happen? Why did bourgeois society conquer the world? Because it conquered the world out of the strength of its social relations. It was a stronger social organism than traditional civilization. Certainly, it's why traditional civilization, that's why the agricultural revolution dominated over the hunter-gatherers, because settled agriculturalists were a stronger social social organism than the hunter-gatherers. That's why they prevailed over the hunter-gatherers. Wherever they could reach them, they conquered or exterminated or enslaved them. How did that happen? Out of a stronger society. Bourgeois society is a stronger society than traditional civilization. The social relations are more powerful. They've revolutionized the entire world at this point. If it was just a matter of brute force, it couldn't have happened. And I think that's the impression that people have. People think that in the 16th and 17th centuries, that Europeans were flying F-16s. They were not, right? They were not militarily more powerful than the people that they conquered through colonialism. They were socially, societally more powerful.
There's also all those material factors, right? Diseases and all that.
Diseases, which is an accident, right? Total accident. Meaning, okay, so the Western Hemisphere hadn't been exposed to certain germs, but they didn't have any natural immunity to smallpox. It's why Africa wasn't really conquered until the Europeans had machine guns, by the way, in the 19th century, the 1800s, right? Because they couldn't simply militarily conquer Africa. No. Or the Middle East, or Asia, right? They could conquer hunter-gatherers. And they could manipulate the civilizations that existed in the Western Hemisphere, the Aztecs and the Incas. They could insinuate themselves and basically take over from the Aztecs and Incas and produce a kind of hybridized, like Mexico is basically a hybrid Spanish and Aztec civilization. That's why Mexican nationalism is very Aztec identified, right? Because that was a civilization dominated other peoples and still dominates other peoples. There are still, in Latin America, there's still a hierarchy that's present. The descendants of the hunter-gatherers are on the bottom. Except in the capitalist era, actually, you get more of a social mobility in the late, but more recent capitalist era. But anyway, going back to it, the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution, the way Marx understands capitalism, because we have to be very clear about this. Capitalism is not bourgeois society. Capitalism is contradiction. According to Marx, capitalism is defined by contradiction. It's the contradiction of the industrial forces of production against the bourgeois social relations. And people think that's socialism. That socialism is like science and technology against bourgeois property. No, that's capitalism. Capitalism is the contradiction of the industrial forces and the bourgeois social relations. So that means that there's a real contradiction there, a real contradiction. And if bourgeois social relations are the social relations of labor, then what we're talking about is how the possibilities of science and technology now go beyond the social relations of labor and create this deformed pathological society where people still have to work for a living. The only way you can claim rights in society is to participate through your labor in a technologized society that doesn't require everyone to labor.
So capitalism starts in the Industrial Revolution.
That's right.
Because that's also Ellen Wood in Origin of Capitalism also says that made the most sense to me, which is capitalism really is a system, is the dominant mode of production when people are compelled to adapt to the capitalist market to survive. Like they have to sell their labor on the market just to buy food. And
That's a little bit different. That's more bourgeois society. That is when you are basically leaving the realm of the subsistence agricultural life of the village community. And so that's a little bit more, that's a complication because that's not the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution is when machines can replace people.
Okay, so are you saying the Industrial Revolution is when bourgeois society enters into crisis,
Yeah.
or the Industrial Revolution
Yeah.
is when capitalism starts?
That's
When
the same thing.
capitalism-
That's the same thing.
Really?
So
'Cause
that is
isn't the whole point that workers have nothing but their labor and they have no means of subsistence. Like they
that's
don't produce their
freedom.
own means of subsistence. That's like Marx's
That's
point.
freedom. That's
Yeah?
freedom. Yeah, of course it's freedom. Because it means that you're not tied to the land anymore. You're not tied to your caste. You're not tied to your family, to your clan, to your tribe. Right. Your labor power is a commodity. You're not a slave of the guild,
Right.
right? Guild
But
crafts
it's
artisans
all
are.
mute compulsion, right? So there's a dialectical.
Yeah, I mean, the compulsion is, again, Rousseau. Society forces us to be free. Society forces us to be free. Meaning our social relations force us to be free in a way that we're not free as animals. So are peasants free? No. And yet we might imagine that they are because, oh, they weren't put on the market. They weren't wage slaves. So they must have been free. They're taken care of by their community.
Well, I guess some would say rich peasants, free peasants who own their own farms, perhaps.
But that didn't happen until the bourgeois era. In other words, the traditional subsistence peasantry, the serfs, right?
Yeah.
Who spent most of their time farming their own communal land and some time farming for the Lord to basically pay for the Lord to be able to be the warrior that he was and protect the realm, right? And also give some to the church so that they can, pour over the scripture and figure out what it means because nobody knows what it means. And so, but most of the time, like people were farming for their own immediate community's benefit and they took care of each other.
Okay, I guess that makes sense, especially with the American Revolution being the really probably the most important event in bourgeois society because the backbone is who? Yeoman farmers and
Yeoman
free laborers.
Yeah, and free laborers and artisans who are not living under the traditional guild system of the old world. Independent farmers, right? But they would also, collaborate. Here's the thing. The neoliberal era gives us this atomized individualism and gives us this kind of libertarianism, this kind of very weird, like, I don't know, almost antisocial attitude, like Ayn Rand or something. That's not bourgeois society. Bourgeois society is cooperation. It's what Marx called cooperation. So he talks about simple commodity production and the consciousness of simple commodity production being the consciousness of cooperation. And then the emergence of capitalism is through the manufacturing era into the industrial era. He calls it cooperation, manufacture, and industry. So those aren't discrete periods, by the way, right? What you have is this emerging contradiction within bourgeois society that produces the Industrial Revolution. And again, this is a very Hegelian idea, which is something generates a self-contradiction out of itself, which then demands that it both negate and transcend, but also fulfill itself, and yet fulfill itself in such a way that it negates itself. Right? So let's keep in mind that Marx is a Hegelian. He thinks that socialism will be the completion and fulfillment of capitalism. Completion and fulfillment of
Capitalism or of bourgeois society?
both aspects of capitalism. Namely, it will be both the fulfillment and the negation of the bourgeois social relations and the industrial forces of production as we experience them under capitalism. Namely, we experience the industrial forces of production as the creation of a surplus human population. It's the post-human, right? It's the, Nick Land singularity, right? That's artificial intelligence is going to replace us, and that's good. No. First of all, that's not going to happen. But second of all, what is this? What is this anti-humanism? What is this post-humanism? What is this nihilism, right? So if you go just with the industrial forces of production as your emancipation, that's going to be actually quite dystopian. Similarly, if we try to just hold on to this kind of Protestant work ethic, bourgeois social relation set of ideals, after we no longer need to live that way, where we have possibilities through science and technology to turn work, as Marx puts it, from life's prime need into life's prime want. Meaning we will work because we want to, not because we need to. Right? So again, the dialectical view of freedom here is that freedom is not just freedom to do whatever you want. Because, if we had the freedom to do whatever we want, we'd probably just do hunting and gathering. Right? We would undo tens of thousands of years of history, which we can't really do. I mean, we might dream that we can do it. We might want it to do it. We might become anarcho-primitivists, or we can become techno-futurists, right? That's the contradiction of capitalism, ideologically projected. It's why some people are techno-futurists and other people are anarcho-primitivists. Some are going for the post-human, and some are going for, in a way, the pre-human, certainly the pre-bourgeois. And, anti-speciesism, let's remember that, right? We could go all the way down the rabbit hole. There is a kind of anti-speciesism, like we shouldn't be so arrogant to privilege the human species. That's the discontent in capitalism. So when people are discontented with capitalism, when they think we should do something else, what they reach for are projections of capitalism. They reach for one-sided projections of capitalism. So capitalism reduces us, as Marx put it, to our animal nature. It reduces us to our animal nature. So we can embrace that.
Augmented survival.
Right. And, that's obviously, this is just not the way that society is going to change. I mean, I guess, if I'm channeling the spirit of Lenin, because I'm trying to do that, he would just say this is bourgeois pessimism. This is some middle-class people might have this kind of pessimism, but the working class doesn't and won't. But the working class is never going to decide, having children is selfish, like AOC says. No.
That's a whole nother topic. Yeah, I could go on.
Right? It's all connected. And so Lenin could simultaneously be in favor of abortion rights and birth control and contraception and say that the working class is interested in having children and we have to defend their right to have children. Right? In other words, it wouldn't just be a negative right to not have children. It would be a positive right to have children too. Right? It would be both. When Trump says that he wants the Republican Party to represent the right to life and the dignity of work, that's pure bourgeois ideology.
in a kind of good way.
Yeah, in the way that appeals to the working class. Who doesn't think that they have a right to their own life?
So the way I understand the basic point you're making is that, well, capitalism's antithetical to bourgeois ideals, despite
Yeah.
also kind of bourgeois ideology being a superstructural justification of capitalist relations politically, at least, like a legitimating ideology, at least. That would account for how liberalism is now, actually existing liberalism as a ideology to legitimize capitalist relations, in the way someone could say Marxism Leninism is a way to legitimize, a bureaucratic rule of sorts.
Right. I mean, what
But
I would say is that, again, based in superstructure, what's important about with Marx with regard to base and superstructure is that they contradict each other. In other words, the bourgeois social relations and the industrial forces of production contradict each other. The socioeconomic base and the ideological superstructure, the proletarianized socioeconomic base and the bourgeois ideological superstructure contradict each other. And this is not, people think contradiction means like two classes who oppose each other's interests. That's not what contradiction means. That would just be like two groups of people who are opposed. That's not a dialectical contradiction. That's not a social contradiction. People think social contradiction means dividing society up into groups who are opposed to each other. That's not what a social contradiction means.
wouldn't that just class conflict?
Well, class in the modern capitalist era, according to Marx, is not the same thing as caste, right? You could say in the caste system, it's apples and oranges. Peasants and aristocrats are different species. They certainly understood themselves to be different species. The aristocrats thought that they had more in common with their horses than with the peasants, because the horses were noble animals in a way that the peasants were not. And they had a whole Christian cosmology, the great chain of being, the hierarchy of creation. God made people different. He made animals different. And that's that. So a peasant is a peasant and a lord is a lord. That's it. Right? That's not what we're living in. Nobody believes that, really. Nobody believes that like a capitalist and a worker are different species. No. Again, capitalism is a crisis of humanism, right? When we talk about capitalism being a crisis of bourgeois values, it's a crisis of humanism. It's a crisis of humanistic values. So for bourgeois thinkers, again, they thought that there was such a thing as the human race, and that there was more similarity than differences among people, and that what differences existed were due to education, were due to upbringing. Biological racism comes later. Of course, they didn't have DNA, they had Lamarckian evolution, right? So you could inherit acquired characteristics, meaning an organism that develops a capacity in their own lifetime could pass it on to their children. That's what they thought, right? So if they observed differences among like races, these were historical differences that developed through culture and could be changed, right? They weren't permanent innate differences based on DNA or something like that. But again, we might think of class as caste, not. We also tend to think of class, it's a weird, in the United States, it's a weird tick, but I guess in other parts of the world, this would also be true. The class is only a problem if there's limited class mobility. Well, no, because the entire working class cannot become even middle class. Like, that's just not possible. And so it's not about class mobility. But I think that you get a lot of middle class people who complain about class when they are downwardly mobile, right? And then suddenly they're workers. And it's like, no, you're just a middle class brat. You just say, okay, so I'll just say, I'm from a working class background. My family is working class. I'm a proletarianized academic. I'm an overeducated fool. And I make below the median income in the United States, living in an expensive part of the United States, a city, right? A northern city. So, class, I don't have any ambitions of mobility. I don't think my family really had any ambition to mobility. They didn't want to start their own business. They didn't imagine that they would get rich. They just wanted to work and have a decent standard of living from their labor. That's what the working class believes in. They believe in basically getting good pay for their labor, having a decent standard of living with their labor. They, because, everybody knows most businesses, like, among working class people, when someone tries to start a business, everyone's like, good luck with that. We hope it works out. But they know that, oh, this person's just going to pour their life savings into something that's probably going to fail.
I mean, but like social mobility is a pretty foundational part of American culture. I mean, even Jeffersonian democracy, the ideal is that everyone will one day be able to own property and kind of have their,
That's not social mobility. That's independent. That's different.
Benjamin Franklin is also kind of if you work hard, you succeed and you can become like wealthy and virtuous.
Well, wealthy meaning like Adam Smith concept of wealth, which is a worker with a high standard of living, because Adam Smith famously wrote that the average worker in England is wealthier than a king in Africa, meaning they have more material goods. And so that's wealth. That's wealth. Wealth is living well, right? And so, of course, everyone wants to live well. But does one really want to be a boss over other people? Does one really want house servants? No, not really. Yeah. Like maybe you need, I guess we kind of have that.
I think that managerialism definitely changes that because,
Right.
Yeah, like adds an appeal and a way to divide classes. And it gives people power over others without giving them much more wealth.
Right. To be a capitalist, what do you need? You need to have enough money that you don't actually have to work. How many people are that? Not many. Or the only work that you do is like managing your investment portfolio. But if you have more than a certain amount of money, you can't even do that. Right. Like you need to basically hire it out to manage your, so even the capitalists don't really make decisions about their capital investment. That's done by others. So capitalism is a social system. It's not a system of individual greedy people who lord it over the rest of us. Capitalism. Another word that I like to put, not capitalistism, capitalism, meaning everybody has to serve capital, including the wealthy trust fund babies.
Right.
Right. So they have to do what capital demands. Otherwise, their investment portfolios go up in smoke. And they go up in smoke anyway, because there are crises of value in capital. Capitalism is a crisis-ridden system, meaning it's not really a system in that sense at all. It's a roll-in crisis, rolls from one crisis to the next. Now, you could say that's freedom. You could say, oh, look at how dynamic the society is. Look at how revolutionary the society is. All that is solid melts into air. Maybe that's freedom. But it's freedom that we don't feel like we can really adequately participate in. And that's why it becomes technologism. That's why it becomes, well, AI is going to replace us. And that might be a good, right? So again, now, liberal democracy, you mentioned democracy, liberalism in terms of liberal democracy. All that means is that people want to stay in the political sphere, but they also want the political sphere to have limits in what it can encroach upon. Right? So liberal democracy means political liberty and civil liberty. So right to participate in the political sphere, but also right against the political sphere. In the 20th century, the big specter was totalitarianism. It was fascism. It was communism. It was totalitarianism. It was basically that the state has all rights and the individual has no rights. And, it's a kind of collectivism over individualism.
Right. And the erosion of civil society, the state into civil society is considered the definition of totalitarianism by most.
And, by that measure, the United States today is pretty totalitarian.
Yeah, I agree. Well, that's
Right.
Wolin's inverted totalitarianism, that
Right.
capitalism creates a totalitarianism by privatizing civil, or rather commodifying civil society and permanent marketization of all spheres of life.
Well, the reason I would say it's not commodification and not marketization and not privatization is that this stuff is not really commodity, nor is it really market, nor is it really private. It's all state managed and controlled.
Well, yeah, it's a co-partnership between the state and capital, as he describes it, which is kind of what fascism is often understood as. But this is kind of like in the inverse, is capital dominates politics. But you get the same effect of the erosion of civil society because, Margaret Thatcher, there is no society, it's just individuals competing on the market. I mean, there's just so much that could be said about this.
I mean, let me invoke Kant, whose birthday was yesterday. So Kant defined marriage as a contract between two individuals for rights to each other's sexual faculties. So entirely transactional. And yet the most important thing about that is that it's two contractual parties, meaning men and women are equal in that transaction. That's the most important part of it. Meaning that's the thing that's different from tens of thousands of years of history.
Right.
That's freedom.
You can choose.
Yeah, you can choose, and it's equality, right? You're not being married off by your family, and there isn't a strict gender hierarchy. There is not. And so that's bourgeois. That's the quintessence bourgeois, right? It's liberty and equality bound up into one, right? So it isn't this like, do we have equality or do we have liberty? Do we have freedom or do we have equality? No, right? That's capitalism. Capitalism creates this antinomy.
You're referring to Hayek, I'm guessing, with that. 'Cause
Sure.
Hayek famously says that liberty and equality are, at odds.
That's right. Well, no, because aren't they dependent on each other? How can you really have liberty for individuals unless they're equals? You can't. Right? How can you really have equality between individuals unless they're free? You can't. Right? So that's bourgeois society in a nutshell. And that's what capitalism contradicts. And it creates these false choices of individualism and collectivism. Right? That's really what we're dealing with here. And it's very unfortunate that as a result of the 20th century, we now associate socialism, overcoming capitalism in the direction of freedom, is associated with collectivism and is hostile to the individual. We forget that the conservatives are hostile to the freedom of the individual too.
Yes, yeah, well, that is something that's surprised a lot of people is when they look into old Canadian conservatism. Well, perhaps old Canadian conservatism was, they call it red Toryism.
Yeah.
Super collectivistic. And there's some who have hypothesized that the reason why Canada had more of a socialist tradition
Yes.
was because of
Red
Tory.
Tory.
So it was easier to, argue in those collective terms. But I mean, is communism, even from a Marxist standpoint, collectivist, but also individualist? It's kind of...
Sure, it's supposed to be both. The freedom of each is supposed to be the precondition for the freedom of all, not the reverse. The freedom of all is the precondition of the freedom of each, according to Marx. But Marx said the freedom of each is the precondition of the freedom of, meaning we can only all be free if each of us is free. So that's important to bear in mind. Also, Marx thought of the ideology of his time, communism and socialism in the 19th century, as a one-sided antithesis to bourgeois private property, including bourgeois private property of one's own labor as a commodity. So, the condemnation of commodity and market by socialists and communists, Marx thought was one-sided and was understandable as a response to the crisis of capitalism, but was an ideological expression of that. Right. And he also, recognized that there was conservative communism, reactionary communism. And so again, the dialectical view that Marx had was that the new ideology that was emerging was liable to misrecognize itself, was liable to misrecognize its true substance and misrecognize its actual purpose. Right. So that's why, we now have this kind of stage idea of like dictatorship of the proletariat, lower stage communism, higher stage communism. But earlier in his career, Marx said, well, communism is just the next stage. It can't be understood as freedom as such, meaning there might be something beyond communism that we can't anticipate because we're not there yet. Right. So again, this idea that socialism and capitalism are opposite values. No, for Marx, capitalism is socialistic in a contradictory way. It socializes production, but in a self-contradictory way. So it both constitutes society and destroys society in the industrial era specifically. But also that socialism as an ideology was a projection of capitalism, that it was capitalist ideology. And it was a bourgeois ideology, we could also say. But it's a bourgeois ideology of the capitalist era, especially with the utopian socialists who really celebrated and championed science and technology as the cure-all for everything, right, in a very technocratic way. And basically said that the scientists should take over and rule society. Marx did not think that. He didn't think that that should happen. He also didn't think that it could happen.
But it is kind of what happened. I mean, to some extent, managing
Sure.
revolution.
Sure.
In all three of the different systems, right? Capitalism, communism, fascism.
But the question is, are these like technocrats really very scientific? Not really, right? In other words, this is where I'll bring in the Frankfurt School. They're more like gangs or rackets or mafias. They're not really scientists or scientific. They're much more, power players. But the problem with bureaucracy is not necessarily the bureaus. In other words, maybe you do need specialized knowledge.
Of course.
You need rarefied knowledge. The question is, should they rule? Should they, be the bureaucracy? No. Right? Like, that's the point. The point is, yes, society needs specialized knowledge and rarefied knowledge and developed skills, but should those people be in charge? The reason that they shouldn't be in charge is not because it's not right, but because it's not going to work. It hasn't worked yet. In other words, have these people prevented the pathologies of capitalism? They're never going to be able to, right? The State Department blob, all the foreign policy experts, have they prevented any wars whatsoever? But they're still trying to.
So one thing I want to circle back to is liberalism's relation to Marxism today, because I think you have a big illiberal current of Marxism today, Stalinism. I think we might have different understandings of that term Stalinism, but we can get into that. But I think there is a partially legitimate reason, because a lot of people who are anti-liberal, I believe, are in a reaction to, one, liberalism as a legitimizing ideology for the state, because it's kind of become a progressive ideology to just legitimize capitalist relations and also give hopes of integration of oppressed groups into that very system. And also it's associated with individualism, kind of a lack of any grand narrative. Yeah, so where does the illiberal turn begin for Marxism? Because some would say it's in Marx himself, some would say it's in Lenin, and you, of course, are against those who divide Marx and Lenin and those who divide Lenin and Luxemburg.
That's
so
right.
I just want to get your positions on this clear.
Right. So, okay, so Lenin's liberalism, going back to that article, that presentation, I pointed out some things. And also in some of my other writings, I pointed this out as well. So the October Revolution in 1917, that Lenin is a leader of, it is a multi-party revolution. So it includes the Bolsheviks of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. It also includes the left socialist revolutionaries. So the socialist revolutionaries were divided in 1917, and one wing joined the Bolsheviks in all power to the Soviets in the Soviet Revolution of October 1917. Also, Trotsky and his group of Mensheviks split from the Mensheviks and joined with the Bolsheviks in the October Revolution. So it's at least a two-party and maybe even in some ways a three-party revolution. Now, the Mensheviks that Trotsky brings over eventually just become Bolsheviks. They're integrated into the Bolshevik Party because they were nominally not members of different parties anyway. They were factions of the same party, the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. And the left SRs break with the Bolsheviks over the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk because they think that the Bolsheviks are selling out Russia. And they kind of exclude themselves. So in principle, it was not meant to be a one-party state. Not at all. And not only can it include multiple parties from the outset, but it can also generate new political differences in the course of the revolution. That's one thing. But the other thing is, I point out that during war communism, Trotsky had advocated for militarizing labor, for basically turning the labor unions into appendages of the state. And Lenin opposed that, saying that the workers needed to defend themselves not only against the state, but even against the Bolshevik Party. So he was against subsuming the unions under the party. He certainly was against subsuming the unions under the state. And, the background, the Marxist movement before 1917, these political parties were fiercely independent. They were the most independent of all political parties. So all the other political parties were much more collusive and collaborative with the state. These were parties of intransigent opposition to the state. And that was everywhere. That was the Socialist Party of America. That was the SPD in Germany. That was also the French Socialist Party, was also a revolutionary party. And of course, the Social Democrat in the UK. And of course, obviously, Russian social democracy, the socialists were opposed to the Tsarist state. But even in liberal democracy, they were opposed to the state. So they were civil social institutions opposed to the state. So they were not opposed to the state simply because the state defended the interests of capital, but they recognized, Marx recognized it in the Critique of the Gotha Program and other writing, and Lenin recognized it in the State and Revolution, that you only need a state as a function of coercion. Most people, when they read Lenin's State and Revolution, they don't get past the first few chapters. So he starts off with the state represents coercion of one class dominating another class. But then he eventually gets to the fact that insofar as bourgeois right continues to exist, picking up on Marx's Critique of the Gotha Program, in the transition to communism, you will still need a state. You will still need a bourgeois state without a bourgeoisie. You'll still need a capitalist state without the capitalist. That's how they understood the dictatorship of the proletariat. So the state meant to be, in the Marxist view, an index of unfreedom. In other words, insofar as the state needs to exist, society is not yet freed itself. And again, what is the state representing? What's the coercion of capital, which remains even after the capitalists are gone? Even after the capitalist bourgeoisie are expropriated and therefore cease to exist as a class. So again, the assumption is that you do not want the state to take over society. That would be unfreedom, not freedom. You want the withering away of the state. You want the functions of the state to be taken over by society itself. You want society to be such that society doesn't need to dominate itself through a state. So the goal, Marx is very clear about this. Lenin's very clear about this. The goal is anarchy. The goal is anarchism. That's the goal. It was only supposed to take a generation. It wasn't supposed to take centuries. It was not. We don't believe in it. Let's just admit we don't. In which case, nobody's a Marxist. Because the Marxists definitely did believe in that. They were super optimistic.
I believe Marx did.
Yeah, Lenin did too.
I'm in a generation.
Well, in Russia, it was all going to depend on revolution outside of Russia.
Right. Well, so this is the contradiction I find, is that the threat of capital doesn't stop with getting rid of capitalists. Now, this just creates a kind of impetus for the state to just get larger and swat down capital or replace capital's functions, like Stalin being a perfect example of that.
Right. The infamous state capitalism thesis, right?
Yeah, I don't buy that.
Yes. So
It's
let's
different, but it's not like I think what Lenin did was state capitalism.
sure.
What Stalin did was a kind of, it was like it had capitalist social relations of production, but kind of a different mode of distribution.
Sure. Okay, so wait. Because we have that now anyway, by the way. We have that now anyway.
Socialist redistribution?
Wait, in some way we do. Of course we do. And it's done, invisibly. In other words, it's not distribution to individuals. Done through like kind of reallocation of tax resources as like capital incentives. It's done. And so, again, it doesn't mean, although they also do things like, earned income tax credit, less and less so. It used to be more significant than it is now. But getting back to it, if capitalism is the contradiction of bourgeois social relations and industrial forces of production, then obviously neither the Soviet Union nor communist China today have transcended that contradiction. So that's what it means to say it's
Sure.
still capitalism. Meaning people are compelled to work under conditions where the employability of labor is contradicted by science and technology. And so what you have in the world is basically various ways that the population is maintained, even though it's redundant and not needed for labor. So you basically have more or less of a welfare state everywhere.
So this is where I'm a bit confused because, yeah, I'm aware of Lenin's skepticism of the state, and this is interesting because one of my mentors was Assad Haider. I don't know if you've heard of him.
Oh yeah, uh-huh.
Yeah, and he's very big on, criticism of the state and revitalizing the Marxist critique of the state. And he's a Badiou enthusiast, and Badiou is, very much also of this type who wants to bring attention again to the anti-statist element of Marxism. But what I found interesting is that they're completely dismissive of liberalism, both of them.
Right.
Completely. And what I find, though, is that if you just try to go for abolition of the state, or even transcending the state without a liberal transition with bourgeois right, I think it does relapse into a kind of, I don't know, be hyperbolic, but like the kind of totalitarianism. Because how to transition to a stateless society, would it not be just having rights that prevent the state, that protects society from the state?
Sure.
Because without a robust bourgeois rights framework, I don't see how you overcome that other than anarchy, which I think is kind of materially impossible. Like the anarchist transition, just, going kind of superseding the state.
Immediately.
Like Mao also wanted to deal with this contradiction, right? Mao, I think, also believed in the state withering away eventually. Sure. But his solution was sort of to just give power. He thought that if you just gave power to, I can't really say workers because it was China's like peasants and students really in that time, but society, that they would build communism, but you actually, without the rights of protection of individuals against each other, you had kind of a weird anarchic totalitarianism.
Yeah, we're more likely to believe in Hobbes nowadays. And Hobbes, we should recall, was a monarchist. He was a reactionary in the context of the English Civil War. And he was not talking about the war of all against all in terms of like people. Like the peasants don't have a war of all against all. The war of all against all is feudal lord are in a war of all against all, and they need a monarch to stop them from just carrying on their war indefinitely. But peasants aren't in a war of all against all. And workers are only in a war of all against all in capitalism. In bourgeois society, they're not. In other words, it's only when you have to struggle to get a job because statistically a certain number of people will not be able to get a job, the unemployment produced by capitalism, that the workers are in a state of war of all against all. And that's internationally, by the way, not just nationally, internationally, globally. The workers are pitted against each other because they're redundant, because the Industrial Revolution has made labor redundant. So the question is, what do we need a state for? Why do we need a state? What's the actual need for a state in capitalism? And it's not naturalized. To not say, oh, well, been a state for thousands of years. Actually, there has not. There's only been a state really in the capitalist era, meaning prisons and police are industrial era inventions. They don't.
In other words, like the monopoly on violence isn't really perfected until the modern era.
But also, you just don't need a police force. You don't. You don't need. The Lords were not a police force. They were not. They handled some things, but they were not a police force. The way the police are like an occupying army. And prisons. I mean, it's true, they just killed people for crimes. And so they didn't bother sending them to prison. They only imprisoned like priests and aristocrats. They only had prisoners insofar as they needed hostages for political reasons.
Or they just enslaved them.
Yeah.
Common, especially in older times.
Sure, you could, right. Well, yes, and there are slaves and there are slaves, meaning there are slaves that you work to death and there are slaves that you don't work to death. Right? And so what would now be prisoners were slaves that you work to death. That's different. And of course, they did that in the United States in the late 19th century too, the chain gangs. They worked people to death. So they gave you a 4-year prison labor sentence, but you did not survive it. And that's white people too. More white people than black people died that way at that time. So there's that, but that's in the capitalist era, meaning that is capitalism. That is not something else.
So one thing that does make sense to me is the idea of liberalism's role in protecting society against the state, and from there having a greater autonomy, building that autonomy. We can think of, like a stateless society from there. That makes sense to me. And that's a big reason why
we need to compete where we're not a mortal threat to each other, because we're a mortal threat to each other. If we apply for the same job and I get it and you don't, that's a mortal threat to you. Oh, shucks. Better luck next time. I mean, yeah, we can say that, but we know what unemployment does to people. It kills them.
Right, yeah. I mean, it's why socialism and democracy are seen as these synonymous things in some respect. But for Marxists anyway. But this is the counterpoint I kind of want to bring up is I do find it a little bit of a contradictory tendency in Marx's own thought regarding his liberalism, because I think unquestionably he's pro-democratic. And I mean, you probably see that very clearly.
Civil liberties.
Civil war in France.
Civil liberty. Like liberalism just means civil liberty. People have civil liberty.
They're different things. Democracy and civil liberties almost sometimes can go at odds.
Yeah, but with liberalism, like when people are like against liberalism, are they against civil liberties? I mean, I guess they're against civil liberties for their political opponents.
Yeah, but that would be against liberalism.
Yeah, but right, and that's why I said civil society against the state and political pluralism. Right?
Sure. Well, that's what I think is. I'm not so sure if that is in Marx. Like, I think he's clearly. I mean, the countries he thought were most advanced were the ones with the best civil liberties, like England and America.
And they even explicitly said, Marx and Engels said, if you have to choose between the right to free speech and the right to vote, you should choose the right to free speech.
Where do they say that? That'd be really good. Actually, I would like to hold that.
I know that Engels, it's in when they're advising like their followers late in life.
Okay, because this is really of importance to me, because I find I get a lot of objections to that, the liberalism and in Marxism. I do see big elements of liberalism in their work for sure, but I mean the dictatorship of the proletariat, right? So the idea that the dictatorship of the proletariat would need to have some kind of what would be an equivalent to bourgeois rights that would constrain the power of the state, that seems antithetical to the dictatorship of the proletariat, because they often say, what communists today will say is, why would you want to constrain the rule of the proletariat? That's what they say.
Well, the dictatorship of the proletariat's going to have to put down strikes, but there's going to be right to strike. but it might also have to put down strikes. In other words, dictatorship of the proletariat is going to be capitalism. It's going to be very similar to what we have now. The only difference is going to be political. In other
Sure.
words, is a socialist party.
How do we not get another Stalin?
Well, by empowering the working class. In other words, the working class is actually, vital. I mean, this is not proven by any means. This is a total hypothetical.
I actually really appreciate that you say that.
Yeah.
Because I think we need to never lose sight of is that Marxism is still like a lot of the core concepts are still in question.
Yeah.
People treat it as a doctrine, like that is like a religious
proven.
doctrine.
It's not a proven doctrine by any means, right? Like not at all. Okay, so my thing is like I, was pretty much converted to Marxism, Communist Manifesto, teenager. I'm like, all right, let's do this. Dictatorship of the proletariat for that. Did I know what I was talking about? Absolutely not. So what's interesting for me, who has studied this history and studied these ideas over decades, and, what do I have to contribute? I'm not going to say I know the truth about like reality, the world. No. What I have is, if you are interested in Marxism, I can tell you some things about it. I can tell you about what the original Marxists thought. I can tell you what Marx and Engels and Lenin and Trotsky and Rosa Luxemburg, what they actually thought, what their assumptions were. Eugene Debs. What did all these people, Karl Kautsky, August Bebel,
those liberal communists like Kautsky, like Debs even, are revisionists. So that's what people say now. And then that's where I think the case you really need to make probably for the audience is why is Lenin, like where is Lenin's liberalism? Because it's because of Lenin's State and Revolution and what is to be done, his polemics against Kautsky really.
Oh, what is to be done is polemic against Kautsky, and neither his State and Revolution is because Kautsky had already like reneged.
Yeah, I'm aware it has little to do with this, but for the audience, I think they confuse Kautsky and Bernstein.
They do, and even Bernstein wasn't as bad as. Let's put it this way: Bernstein wasn't as bad as the left today is. Bernstein was a lot better than the left today is, than the DSA is, or the tankies are. Bernstein was better, more clear, more honest, more direct, less less muddled about things. And so better in that way, right? But also better, his assumptions were better, meaning Bernstein still assumed the social and political power of the working class in a way that neither the latter-day social democrat, like the DSA, nor the tankies. They do not start with the assumption that the working class can have the adequate social and political power to do.
I'll give credit to the Maoists. They do think that, though.
Do they?
I'm critical of the Maoists, but the Maoists, that is one thing that I will acknowledge that they do get right compared to the tankies. The rest of the tankies is they do see like you need to build institutions of that empower the working class. And well, they use the word oppressed masses. So,
yeah, sure.
Working class and peasants, depending on what country you're in, really.
Uh-huh.
But they see that. I mean, they see that as Mao's contribution to Marxism, as being a kind of and against the state.
Right, and yet, right, how empowered were they in China under Mao?
I mean, they were in the Cultural Revolution. I just think it was.
Were they?
Yeah, until they called in the military after.
I mean,
they were. I mean, that's something.
The Red Guards were let loose, but what about your average peasants, your average workers? No.
In China or the world?
China.
Oh, absolutely. That was one of the best times ever to be a student, unless you didn't join it.
Students, Red Guards, students.
There wasn't many workers in China.
PMC. They were the Red Guards with the PMC in China.
Yeah, there's actually truth to that. But what I'm saying is it did empower the masses, at least a section of the masses.
But the peasants and the workers were not empowered.
Peasants, yes, I would say.
Only in certain ways. Only as like state.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the attacks on bureaucrats were waged by peasants.
Some were. I guess there are different stages of the Chinese
Throw the
Revolution.
emperor off his horse. That was a slogan
Uh-huh.
against like bureaucrats. They had this
Sure.
Chinese term for, I think, little tyrants. I forget what it is, but they called the bureaucrats little emperors. That's what they called them.
Right. I mean, what I'm talking about is like actual empowerment. In other words, did these people take over the state, or were they just used as shock troops for some bureaucrats to get rid of other bureaucrats?
Fair. That's a fair point.
That's what it amounted to in the end. Meaning, I'm sure that Mao intended otherwise. Perhaps I'm willing to give him the benefit of the doubt. But then the question is, how was it done? And if it's done through a kind of highly ideological, like mass mobilization, I mean, the older, so I mentioned Bernstein, so the older, like, socialist parties, the world of Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg, the working class had built up its forces socially and politically over decades. It really had power, right? It wasn't like, oh, we're just going to say that you have power. They actually did have power, right? And that was meant to be the preparation for the revolution, because the revolution can't work unless people are really prepared to take power. And again, in Russia, the example of a working class revolution was fairly limited, meaning the working class was decently organized, well organized enough to overthrow the czarist state, but it proved not well organized enough to transform society. I mean, it's really
Didn't Lenin try to give ownership to the factories to workers and they sold them, or something along those lines? That was in People's History of the Russian Revolution.
Yeah, there's a lot that went on. I mean, basically, the pre-World War I and pre-revolutionary working class in Russia was liquidated in many respects as a function of the Civil War, especially. So a lot of workers had to flee the cities to go back to the country just to be able to eat, right? So they had to go rejoin their families who were peasants in the countryside just to be able to get food. And then other workers who were very politically motivated created shock troops who were sacrificed in the Civil War. So they went to fight the whites and got themselves killed. You know, that's where your organized working class went.
Yeah, they're either dead or tired, I think that was
Yeah.
the famous quote.
Yeah. And, you know, it's tragedy. I mean, it's a real tragedy. But again, it wasn't just a matter of mass mobilization. That's what you got in the 5-year plan. That's what you got with Stalin later. You got a kind of mass mobilization in the countryside, and you got a mass mobilization of like the workers were supposed to like work longer and harder, you know, self-sacrifice to build up industry. You get that in the Great Leap Forward in China, right? But that's not organization. That's like a bureaucrat's idea of organization.
I agree with those. I do think the Cultural Revolution is different because they had their own organizations, and I mean they're also armed. The Red Guards had their own arms. They had their own separate organizations, very different from like, you know, we all are in these state-controlled communes.
That's true.
For the state.
True.
But I guess the question I'm asking, because Lenin, of course, creates the Cheka, the secret police, during the Civil War as a defensive maneuver, and some people say that's, you know, Lenin, the dictator, whatever.
You know who the head of the Cheka was?
Who?
A close collaborator, Felix Dzerzhinsky, a close collaborator of Rosa Luxemburg. Because he came out of her party, which is the Social Democratic Party of the Kingdom of Lithuania and Poland. So it was, yeah, and she couldn't believe it. She's like, Felix is the head of the secret police? Wow. Right? They gave him that job because he was seen as very principled and incorruptible.
Right. And well, the question people want to ask, right, is how do you prevent this type of state of exception from degenerating into a, whatever you want to call it, state capitalist, bureaucratic state? So like, how does that get prevented, and what is liberalism's
role in that?
Yeah.
It's the preservation of civil society and the possibilities and, you know, actual resources for independent working class organizing in the dictatorship of the proletariat. So the dictatorship of the proletariat is meant to be like a fluid, dynamic situation that's trying to overcome its own necessity. Right? It's not trying to institutionalize itself. It's not trying to become a new state. It's a state that's supposed to immediately begin to wither away. Meaning the state in capitalism is an emergency measure that has become institutionalized. So it can only be dissolved insofar as the necessity for that institutionalized emergency measure is overcome. Right? But the question is, how is that to be overcome? It's not through some magic formula of policy. It is going to be through the actual power of the working class to transform society. Meaning the political revolution and the social revolution are different things. So the political revolution is you have parties claiming to be socialists who smash the state and establish a dictatorship of the proletariat. That's the political revolution. The social revolution comes after that, meaning the transformation of society. If that doesn't happen, then of course the dictatorship of the proletariat is just going to become state capitalism.
Would it also be dividing power within the state? Because
it really depends.
I brought up in one of my discussions with Assad Haider and some students back a couple years ago, was I said, well, do constitutional rights not matter? Like I think they do, in so far as you need to codify rights to independence from the state and divide power in such a way that that is actually institutionalized. The power of the working class is institutionalized. And he brought up the point, which is a fair point, but I think it was a little, didn't go far enough, which was that Stalin's constitution was democratic and it had the freedom of speech and it had all of these rights.
Sure, formally
you would have. Yeah, we all know that didn't really.
The same way we have
happen.
It formally here in the United States now, but not really.
Sure. I mean, well, we do, but we don't. Like, I would say we do more than the Soviet Union.
Only insofar as there's any political pluralism, right? In other words, like, if there wasn't a Republican Party keeping the Democratic Party in check, then our ability to exercise our formal rights would be greatly diminished.
That's my point precisely there, is that the rights themselves mean nothing without a separation of power. And people are very hostile. I used to be very hostile to the idea of a multi-party socialist system. Because I thought that there's this easy opportunity for it to kind of collapse or for opportunists. This is what
it can fail. In other words, like this socialist project, this attempt to overcome capitalism can always fail. We have to risk that.
See it as essential. I do see it as essential now, but one should be very realistic and almost Machiavellian in terms of governance, because if we take bourgeois society on its terms, right, it allows freedoms insofar as the working class is not empowered. Like, I mean, in most cases, for perfect examples, the Black Panthers, they brought out the big guns of the deep state to destroy them. There's no liberal rights there, but there's liberal rights insofar as it divides power of the property owning classes. I'll say broadly the dominant classes over the dominated classes is a terminology I prefer. But in a socialist society, would it not be the goal to, on one hand, uphold the dictatorship of the dominated classes, but also divide the dominated classes to prevent one faction from dominating each other, kind of like how the founders wanted to prevent factions from dominating each other? Because I think that's one of the smart things of the. One thing I said is in opposition to someone who said, well, the founders just wanted a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. And I'm like, yes, but no. Because they also didn't want any one faction to dominate. That's they preserved their society very effectively, I think, for that. But the dictatorship of the proletariat, does it also not need checks on itself? Not just in terms of,
realistically, right? So the ideology of like PMC type people, like, Marxist intellectuals, middle-class radicals, whatever you want to call them, right? And that could include individual workers who are jacked up on ideology. So it's not about like one's personal class position. It's really about how one sees oneself as a political actor. So the left today, generally, I would say that they might have one idea, but realistically, how are you going to get a majority or even a significant plurality of the working class in a country like the United States to organize and be mobilized and be able to lead the rest of society in making a revolution? You're not going to do it by being against civil liberties. That's not, no. In other words, some very discontented, nihilistic middle-class kids might be hostile to civil liberties, but no, you're never going to lead the masses that way. Never.
I absolutely agree. And that's the question I want to ask you, which we can talk about in the back room, is about MAGA communism, certain trends, because I think the broader tendency is tankies. People say tankies, but I think there's also an anti-civil liberties element.
Tankies just means the people who supported the crushing of the Hungarian uprising in 1956 and the Prague Spring in 1968.
Yeah. And also, I would say just generally think that Stalinism wasn't a regression, but a progression of Marxism. They don't see Stalinism as a stand. They see it as, actually, if anything, preservation, and they see Khrushchev as
the betrayal.
Yeah, exactly. That's their sort of narrative. And but weirdly enough, they also tend to think that modern China is also headed in a Marxist direction. There's divisions within them.
Yeah.
But I also see a liberal tendency in anarchists too.
Sure.
Who tend to think that as long as it's democratic, we can civil liberties.
Right.
They're very pro-purging. They're very pro-cancel culture. That's what I find strange.
Yeah. Of course they are.
We'll talk about that all in the in the back room, which you can get access to by becoming a patron. While you're at it, definitely check out Chris's book that just came out. It's a collection of his essays called The Death of the Left, or is it Death of the Millennial Left?
Death of the Millennial Left.
Right.
It's really about this recent history. And then the companion volume, Marxism and Politics, you can pre-order now through Amazon or Sublation Press directly, because literally it's going to the printer. So it's coming out immediately. And that's the more theoretical and historical stuff. In terms of this kind of, I don't know, Marxology or something, whatever you want to call it, I think the Death of the Millennial Left is much more about like the history of the recent crisis of capitalism, going back to the War on Terror and the Great Recession and Occupy, and then kind of cashing out in the Bernie Sanders.
Right. Yeah. It's very much on the American left, and it's, even though they're separate essays, it's very chronologically organized, kind of in a way that gives a good history, especially for younger listeners. And I would say younger listeners, that's even below 40. A lot of people are stuck in the present moment of immediacy. Historicize our past. So anyway, without further ado, give a 5-star rating if you enjoyed. Check out Chris's work, and see you in the back room.
My only hope is that when enough people become pessimists, then out of despair somebody maybe does something. But you know why I also like to be a pessimist? Because it's the only way to have a nice life. If you're an optimist, then always bad things happen and you are always disappointed. When you are a pessimist, then you look around, okay, there are bad, but from time to time something nice happens, and you are, as a pessimist, you are a little bit glad all the time, no?
You are listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.